Now it's time to introduce our speaker. Robert Nordlund is the president of Association Reserves and a registered professional engineer. Robert is also a certified reserve specialist, was involved in creating national reserve study standards, and has greatly influenced this industry for the past 30 years. He regularly writes on the topic of reserve studies and speaks at industry functions throughout the nation. Association Reserves has prepared over 45,000 reserve studies for association governed communities throughout the United States. Robert is often called to serve as an expert witness in litigation involving reserve issues. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Robert Nordlund. Robert?
Well, thank you, Paige, and hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Reserve Studies 103, the Funding Plan. Here at Association Reserves, our job is to help you plan for the inevitable major expenses facing your association. We're aware that an appropriate reserve funding plan, the amount of funds that needs to be set aside toward reserves, is the key to being prepared for those expenses. So this webinar is designed to help you get a comfortable understanding of what all the influences are, so you know we've considered all the options and are designing a funding plan that is best for your association. We can work around some of those influences, but other influences are real constraints. We want to set you up for an improved future, ready to implement an appropriate multi-year reserve funding plan for your association. Those of you who indicated who you haven't been making your reserve contributions, we want to give you a comfort level that they are necessary, this is how they're calculated, and this is what's appropriate for your association. As Paige indicated earlier, this course is now approved for CE credit through two organizations, CAM-ICB and the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulations, so Florida CAMs can get credit. Those of you who indicated in the registration process that you were interested in CE credits will receive a certificate of completion within approximately 1 week, so please be patient. Even though this is a live presentation, we've muted everyone to keep the background noise to a minimum. Even so, I invite your involvement, so every once in a while I'll ask for your feedback, and the way to respond is to raise your hand by clicking on the hands raised icon in your control panel. It looks like the one you see on screen. Look around for it now. Just give it a moment. And if you came with a question, or if at any time you have a question that arose due to something I've said, just type it in the dialog box in your control panel. Again, similar to the one that you see on screen. Paige is going to be busy monitoring that during our session today, and she'll select from those at the end during our Q&A time. I hope you have some paper and are taking notes, but just to give you some peace of mind, I want to let you know that our session today is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website for future reference. We'll create and send an outline to all attendees who fill out a survey at the end of today's session. That's how we get information about how to tweak and adjust our programs, how to make them more applicable for you. And that outline that we send will contain answers to all the questions you ask, even the ones I don't have time to answer live. So without further delay, let's give it a test. Give me a hands raised if you're ready for me to get going on the presentation. Hands raised, everyone? Oh, very nice. Good. Okay, I'm going to click everyone's hands down, and here we go. All right, well, I'm presuming you joined us today to more confidently understand how much of your hard-earned cash and that of your neighbors needs to be set aside in order to avoid the primary problems with reserves of special assessments and deferred maintenance. I want to minimize the chance that through indecision or foolish decisions, you underfund or overfund reserves or cause a hardship for the owners. It's not just plug in the numbers and out comes a funding recommendation. For instance, for the same association with the same starting balance and the same assumptions for interest and inflation, we could easily generate these 4 different reserve contribution recommendations you see on your screen. So let me begin to walk you through the influences and the decision points that give us all these different types of numbers. And let's start with the biggest influence, creating what I describe as hard numbers where there is little or no flexibility. The largest influence, you might guess, is the component list itself, the list of projects the association needs to plan to accomplish. These are defined by the variety and type of assets the association is responsible to maintain. You have roofing, you have painting, you have asphalt, you have elevators, you have hallways, swimming pools, or you don't have those assets. Maybe you have tot lots. It's all a matter of the variety and type of assets the association is responsible to maintain. And they are a certain age and they're a certain size, and they will cost a certain amount of money to replace. The component list summarizes all those assets. All the rest of the reserve study is built on the reserve component list. Now here's a sample reserve component list that we'll be using today. It's probably shorter than most, but it will do for the purpose of today's webinar. I expect you've all seen something like this before. Each component has a description of what it is, a useful life estimate, that's UL in years, remaining useful life in years, and a current cost estimate. We've done a webinar on assembling the reserve component list, so for those of you interested in learning how the components are selected and installed into the reserve study, I direct you to that webinar. You can see it by going to our website, reservestudy.com, and going through to our Learning Center. It's a webinar we call Reserve Studies 101. The second result of every reserve study is an evaluation of reserve fund strength. Basically, how are you doing? Do you feel good or do you feel bad about how much money you have in reserves? And that's a measurement of how the association's reserve cash compares to the needs defined to buy your component list. The strength of the reserve fund is typically reported in terms of percent funded, which shows or reveals how well your historical reserve contributions have kept pace with deterioration. Basically, if you're keeping up and you're giving your association the money it needs, offsetting deterioration, or if you're getting behind and you're kind of thin on cash to do the projects needed at the association. And the third result of every reserve study is a calculation of the contributions necessary to offset that ongoing deterioration and prepare the reserve fund so your association has enough money for when your projects come due. What the reserve fund strength and the reserve funding plan have in common is that they're both calculated results. Our Reserve Studies 102 webinar, we've done that live and it's also available as a recording on our website, is an overview of all those calculations and the entire financial analysis side of the reserve study. And that brings us here to where we fit in today with Reserve Studies 103. You might be able to kind of sense where I'm going. Funding calculations are going to be based on the component list and the association's starting reserve fund strength. Well, fortunately, I'm not making this up as we go, and it's not proprietary to association reserves. All the curriculum that we have here today and the concepts I share with you are based on National Reserve Study standards. So they form the basis of reserve study preparation here and there and everywhere across the country by all credentialed reserve specialists. Now, let me start with showing you how the reserve fund strength affects the reserve funding plan, the size of the actual reserve contributions. There are implications, or you might say consequences, to having a strong or weak reserve fund besides just feeling good or feeling bad. To no surprise, associations with relatively little in reserves with a low percent funded face a high exposure to special assessments and deferred maintenance, like the associations in the 0 to 30% funded red range on the left side of this chart. Those are two bad things your association should want to avoid. So there's a benefit to having a strong reserve fund. Confidence you can get your reserve projects done on time when they need to happen. So when the roof starts leaking, or when you get feedback from an owner that their real estate agent said their unit would sell for a higher price if there was a fresh coat of paint, or if the lobby had new carpet, that's no time to begin the process of trying to pass a special assessment and generate some cash. You're already suffering from the consequences. Building a strong reserve fund takes a combination of years of preparation and preparation with appropriately sized contributions. If your percent funded is low, typically your association is going to need to have higher contributions while it's in the catch-up mode, building reserve fund strength to lower the risk of a special assessment. The weaker the reserves are, either the longer it's going to take or the steeper the increases you're going to have in reserve contributions, or both. And then you can imagine, if I take that one step further, how the timing of your reserve expenses has an influence. If you have a large expense in the first few years, you may have to significantly increase your reserve contributions, or maybe even pass a special assessment. That's the ultimate increase, to build reserve fund size and strength quickly to prepare for that expense. Reserve cash flow problems are common when the percent funded is down in the 0 to 30% funded range. So it's good to raise your reserve contributions enough to get out of that high risk range. This means that with exactly the same components, an association down in the 0 to 30% funded range will likely need or want higher contributions than the identical association that's well funded. So give me a show of your hands if you get that. Associations that are behind and need to do some catching up are going to fundamentally need higher reserve contributions. Very good. Okay, you're tracking. That's the first main point. When you need to be catching up, you need to be putting more money into reserves than just if you're staying steady. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to put hands down. Okay, I want to take a moment while we're on this point and reinforce the fact that percent funded calculations and funding plan calculations are different types of calculations for different purposes. They give us different types of results. They both are built on the same component list, but that's about their only similarity. Well, let's get back to our original question about how much your particular association this year needs to contribute. You know that it's fundamentally driven by the component list, the assets you're responsible to maintain, and it's influenced by the reserve fund strength of the association, and if it's in catch-up mode or not. Okay, to answer the question about reserve contribution size, we need to go to National Reserve Size Standards, and that gives us a nice set of 4 funding principles, a guide for what we're trying to accomplish. Follow on the screen. They state that a funding plan should provide sufficient cash when needed, keep the contributions stable through the years, evenly distribute the contributions over the homeowners over the years so everyone pays their fair share along the way, and be fiscally responsible, compliant with governing documents, state law, corporate code issues, all those types of things. And here's a reminder of the challenge. This is a typical set of reserve expenses through the years. It's large in some years and small or even zero in others. It's very typical that your reserve expense scenario is going to look something like this. It's very irregular. That's just the nature of this field. And per National Reserve Size Standards, you're encouraged and guided towards providing for these expenses in a smooth, fair, responsible way using the association's stable income stream. This means that the big expense years, as I indicated before, are going to take years of gradual, smooth preparation. So when we talk about years of preparation, you need to understand that the effects of interest and inflation over all those years are real and significant. Interest and inflation don't cancel each other out. Interest only works on the cash that you have in the bank, while inflation has its effect on the entire value of every component, and that's a much larger result. This means that ignoring interest and inflation typically results in understating reserve contribution needs of the association by approximately 10%. It's going to be a losing game of catch-up as costs continue to increase much faster than interest builds up on the tiny amount of reserve cash that you have in the bank. Associations that ignore interest and inflation in the reserve planning are regularly surprised when they update the reserve study how much they need to increase their reserve contributions. They just weren't planning for the reality of interest and inflation. Okay, now let's talk about the influence of reserve funding objectives, where you're starting and where you're intending to go. Earlier I introduced the concept of being behind and an association needing or wanting to increase their contributions to do some catching up and build their reserve fund strength. And again, there's some value to having a strong reserve fund. Now let me take that concept a little bit further. There's value in the peace of mind that comes from knowing your reserves can handle anticipated upcoming expenses and your owners are not exposed to those surprising and, if any of you have done it, undesirable special assessments. So let's look at this reserve planning chart. Let's say we're at year 0 over on the left. As we move towards the future, gradually moving towards the right, special assessments and deferred maintenance are going to be common any year you're down in the red or pink 0 to 30% weak range. And those same reserve cash flow problems are going to be rare if you're up in the green, strong, above 70% range. So that gives us kind of a scale and scope for where we might be heading in the future. So it all boils down to risk management, how much margin you want to build into your reserve funding plan to avoid special assessments. Now this presumes that your reserve components are stable and that you've effectively identified all your assets. What we find is that on average, full funding contributions are 10 to 20% higher than baseline contributions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it costs more to be fully funded. Well, you might be saying, are you crazy, Robert? You just said it was going to be 10 to 20% more. Well, that's because special assessments are the great equalizer, catching associations that have been making too low contributions. The roof still needs to be replaced, whether you're paying for it with ongoing contributions or a special assessment. So your choice is really how you pay for your reserve projects, not how much. The expenses are going to happen. If you skimp too much on your reserve contributions, you're going to catch right back up with special assessments. So reserve contribution size is influenced by your association's risk tolerance. Do you want to dig deep and take a pound of flesh from your owners with a special assessment? Or do you want to set a responsible budget and pay over time? Now you might have gathered from my choice of words that I'm a strong advocate for a strong reserve fund with a low risk of special assessments. It fits in nicely with the National Reserve Standards funding principles, and I just can't see how it's in the best interests of your owners or how it's financially responsible to face the exactly same predictable expenses with special assessments when you could increase reserve contributions a few dollars and collect it all over time, and that actually reflects the true cost of homeownership in the association, so everyone pays their fair share over time. Well, let's look at some real numbers. Let's go back to that component list. If you take each component's cost and divide it by its useful life, you find out the current cost of deterioration in terms of dollars per year. Let's pick an easy one, the pool resurface, the second one. $10,000 cost over 10 years is a deterioration of $1,000 a year. Same with asphalt seal. $5,000 cost, 5-year useful life, it deteriorates at the cost of about $1,000 a year. For this component list, you do that same calculation, add them all up, you find out that the building repaint at $5,000 a year is the most significant to the association, and you also find out that the total deterioration rate, cost per year, nothing you can do about this. The rate at which your assets are deteriorating is a little over $20,000, $20,170. Now, if all you're doing is offsetting deterioration, you won't be building reserve fund strength, or on the other hand, allowing your reserve fund strength to decline. In other words, if you start out at about 50% funded now, that's about where you'll stay through the years if all you're doing is offsetting deterioration. But if you are able to raise your reserve contributions a bit, you can build reserve fund strength. And this is how the funding objective affects reserve contributions. Building reserve fund strength from a position of low percent funded to a higher percent funded will require slightly higher reserve contributions. Basically, you're stepping on the gas a little bit harder. And of course, the opposite is true. Let's say you have some turnover on the board and there's a new voice saying your reserves will stay cash positive if you contribute less. And of course, that may be true for a while. You can contribute less than your ongoing rate of deterioration for a while. Eventually, you run out of money. But in the process, you weaken your reserve fund and you expose your association to the risk of a special assessment or deferred maintenance. And then all your owners are going to pay in a lump sum what they saved in those lower reserve contributions. So what you're going to find is that or what we find as we're dealing with many associations, is that for every association, when you have a stable component list and good estimates for interest and inflation, or reasonable estimates for interest and inflation, there's a pretty narrow band of contributions that are going to end up being just right for your association, providing for the anticipated reserve expenses. Okay, let me turn to another influence, and this is a big deal: the method that's been used, either straight line or cash flow, to calculate the contributions. Like before, exactly the same components, exactly the same component list. So even with the same starting amount in reserves and the same interest and inflation assumptions, it's not uncommon to find a 50% difference in reserve contributions. And hopefully you're listening and saying, how can that be? Because if you have the same expenses, how can you have such a different income stream to pay for those same expenses? How can that be? Well, let me take you through the process, starting with the component method. That's what the straight line method is called in official National Reserve Study standard terms, and so that's how I'll refer to it through the rest of this webinar. In the component method, following its name, funding calculations are done on individual components, line item by line item. Basically, it's a calculation of how much is needed, what's the cost, how much do you have, you subtract the difference, find out how many years you have available to make up that difference and prepare for that eventual cost. Then you move down the list and do that same calculation for the next component. In addition, the focus of the component method is the initial year's contributions. How much is needed this year with the time available. Not a focus on downstream future effects. And it only points the association towards being fully funded, which actually it does rather rapidly. Fully funded is providing for the component to have the amount of cash it needs at the time that it will have a projected expenditure. So, but now you know that fully funding and building reserve strength rapidly are clues that make you think higher contributions. And if that's true, then you are doing a great job of listening. Now let me show you how it works. This is the component list we've been using, and I've highlighted a few of the components kind of pinkish. So let's focus on individual line items. The component method requires the pool furniture, the top component, to have $4,600 in the initial year. Move your eyes down the list and you see that the asphalt seal and asphalt resurface funds each are going to need to have $5,000 and $25,000 respectively, each within 2 years. And the building repaint fund, the one most significant to the association, is going to need to have a total of $50,000 by the end of next year. So getting enough cash, pouring enough cash rapidly into each of those individual buckets or funds, while at the same time funding all the others, is going to require some high reserve contributions in the short term while you're doing some of that catching up. Well, if you actually do the calculations year after year, presuming the association follows the plan, this is what the multi-year funding plan looks like. High in the first few years while the association is in that steep catch-up mode. Remember, we're starting partially funded now, you've got to catch up because you don't quite have as much as you should have, and rapidly strengthening each of those individual buckets, particularly ones with a short remaining useful life, as you prepare for those near-term expenditures. After those near-term expenditures, you've got the full useful life to prepare for the next one, so the contributions drop when you have longer to prepare for the next expense. No more need to catch up. So you get high contributions for a while in the first few years, dropping down to lower contributions later. That makes for a challenging start to a reserve funding plan. Give me a hands raised if you see that while the association is in catch-up mode, you're going to have higher reserve contributions. Good, good, good. Okay, Paige, everyone's still hanging with us very nicely. Okay, I'm going to put hands down. So in summary, the component method only effectively pursues the conservative full funding objective. It has no ability to share funds between components on an ongoing basis or achieve limited reserve fund strength. It's filling individual buckets of money up and getting them ready for the next expense. So with component method calculations, they're pretty simple, line by line. Finding out how much more reserves you need for each component in time to prepare for the next expense. But because the average association is underfunded, component method calculations force a relatively rapid approach to full funding, meaning that the reserve contributions are temporarily high while the association is in that catch-up mode. And all other things being equal, in the first few years of the funding plan, contributions calculated with the component method are going to be much more than contributions calculated with the same cash flow method. And I'll show you how in just a minute. But that's the worst kind of news at the worst time, forcing homeowners to rapidly, and that's the key word, rapidly, make up for the underfunding of the past. And they're going to argue, well, why is it my problem and not last year's problem? And that's an easy can to kick down the road. And this tends to make funding plans prepared with the component method bad news and easy to resist when it comes to budget time. So let's shift and talk about the cash flow method and what it is and why it has some advantages. This way of calculating reserve contributions focuses on expense totals, not components. So the user designs a multi-year income stream sufficient to offset expenses through the years. It's all about income and expenses, cash flow through the entire reserve fund. A strength is its flexibility. Remember, in this comparison, we'll be using exactly the same components and expenses as we used in the last example. No magic here. So when looking at expenses over the years, the cash flow method doesn't care if in a year's expenditure you've got one project or a combination of projects. I think we learned that 2 years away was asphalt seal and asphalt resurfacing. Here you can see you can't see that and you really don't care. It's just how much reserves are necessary to pay the expenses in any given year. And because of its flexibility, you can design a nice, smooth funding plan that floats upwards with inflation. So current and future owners effectively pay the same value towards reserves while providing sufficient funds responsibly for the anticipated reserve expenses. And that ticks off a few of the objectives on that National Reserve Funding Plan principles chart, the 4 principles. Now you look at this is a much friendlier multi-year reserve funding plan to start on because it avoids the high contributions in the first few years of a component method funding plan. And note how reserve contributions are in the few $1,000s range through all its 30-year term. Okay? And I'm going to contrast that to the slide I showed a moment ago about the component method funding profile. The contributions are still in the few $1,000s range, but they start high and drop rather than floating up gradually and smoothly. The grand total of contributions through the years is likely to be very much the same. And it, of course, has to be because we're talking about providing for exactly the same expenses. The primary difference between the component method and the cash flow method ends up being the shape of the contribution profile over the years. Same total of contributions, just a different profile. Can I get a hands raised if you're with me on this point? That's the reason that they're different. It's the profile, not the total amount of cash over the years. Great. Okay, thanks. Again, you're following along nicely. And that's the reason why any day, if I'm asked, I'll advise associations to use the cash flow method rather than the component method to calculate their reserve contributions. It's fundamentally to your advantage. It's smoother, it's an easier plan to implement if you've calculated it using the cash flow method. And here's another factor that's of influence, and this influence is only for those using the component method, and it's an accounting issue. So remember, in the component method, the reserve fund is divided into separate accounts for each component. Each one stands on its own, and it may look something like this. Unfortunately, the case too often happens that the association needs, and let's say for argument's sake, funds for asphalt and fencing in the near future, and that for some reason, maybe because it's an average association, the funds allocated to those components are right now insufficient. They're not quite on track. So by now you know that this is going to force temporary high reserve contributions while they're trying to rapidly throw some funds into asphalt and fencing while funding all the other components. But a clever treasurer or bookkeeper will note that if they can reassign some funds from other components to asphalt and fencing like this, basically robbing Peter to pay Paul, the resulting calculated reserve contributions overall are lower. But then you think for a moment, if you can simply reassign reserves from one component to another, why are you always assigning them in the first place? What's the value in tracking reserve balances at all for each component? Why not just consider them all one fund? Take out the walls altogether, use them when needed, because indeed you know that for almost every association out there, you can reassign funds from one reserve component to another without it being an issue. And this is how reserve fund is viewed by the cash flow method. No barriers between individual component funds, just reserves. Monthly accounting becomes simpler because the association just makes one reserve transfer to the reserve fund. No more need to allocate funds individually to each of the 10, 15, or 50 different reserve components. In the component method, you're continually dealing with different buckets of money, trying to make sure each one individually gets ready for its own upcoming expenditure. That's a lot of targets that you're trying to hit. While in the cash flow method, you have just one reservoir of reserves where you balance that steady contribution rate against irregular annual reserve expenses, no matter which individual component or combination of components occur in a particular year. The flexibility of the cash flow method about how much to hold in the reserve fund allows it to be used to achieve any of the three National Reserve Say standard funding objectives just by varying the amount of cash that you keep in that reservoir. So you can achieve full funding, threshold funding, or the barely cash positive baseline funding objectives. So the cash flow method is nice and flexible, but too often it's been stereotypically used to design baseline reserve contributions that almost, unfortunately, completely deplete the reserve fund. And that gives cash flow method and baseline funding a bad reputation because of all the special assessments that occur when you only baseline fund, because as I think I showed you earlier, you end up charging the owners special assessments for all the funds that you saved with lower contributions. And that kind of unfairness and irregularity is in conflict with National Reserve Say standard funding principles that state that reserve contributions should provide sufficient cash in a fiscally responsible, not risky manner, spreading out the contributions evenly and fairly over the owners over the years. So with all these issues going on, it helps to have a guide on your team, someone familiar with the tools, the methods, and all the influencing factors, someone who can design a funding plan for your association, one that's easy to implement and use, that's going to provide for the association's anticipated expenses. Remember that cost of deterioration based on your components is real. It's just as real as any other bill the association faces. There's no magic to make the asphalt project go away, the pool project go away. These things don't last forever. These projects are going to happen. They are all very predictable. And that cost of deterioration is significant. In our studies, looking back on our clients, we find that most associations need to plan on setting aside between 15 and 40% of their total budget towards reserves. And by that I mean total homeowner income. If your assessments are $100 a month, then 15 to 40% means $15 to $40. Now, where your association falls in this range is something that you learn in your reserve study. You might find that yours is a reserves efficient association and your magic number is down in the 17% range, or you may find that you have a lot of asphalt, you have walkways, you have bridges, decks, streams, fountains, rec room, tennis courts, all those kinds of things, and yours may be up in the 38 or 40% range. It's all dependent primarily, as I showed at the beginning, on the basis of the components that you have in your reserve set. You can't shake that reality. But I want to encourage you to think that even though this is a big chunk of your budget, reserve contributions are not too expensive. For the average condo owner, it boils down to about the cost of a premium cup of coffee per day to pay for their reserve contributions, the maintenance of their home. And this is well within the means of the average condominium homeowner. If you roll the numbers out, it's $2 to $5 per day, and that ends up being $60 to $150 a month. And that's down there in the range of normal bills a homeowner pays. Gasoline, cell phone bill, or cable and internet. It's just a normal bill that you pay to run your household. It's not too expensive. Well, our role here at Association Reserves is to guide and counsel, to give you that voice of wisdom, to help you plan a financially sustainable budget for your association, pointing you with confidence towards an improved future. We want you to know what the decision points are. You're the one who gets to decide your priorities and what you actually choose to implement. We want to help you understand what's important and give you a plan that is fundamentally easy to implement. Our desire is to design that funding plan, provides for the needs of the association, maximizing home values, and doing it in a fiscally responsible way that minimizes board member liability exposure. We know that all the board members are a bit on the hot seat. We know that all managers are trying to find a way to lay it out clearly, faithfully, so the board members get it, and we want to be on that team. And in summary, it's the physical makeup of your association that makes the most difference. The expenses are what they are. When they occur matters, whether they're close or many years away. Remember, the interest and inflation are very real and they affect the size of your reserve contributions. Where you are as far as starting reserve fund strength. Computation method affects the size of your reserve contributions, and the profile of those contributions over the years, and your funding objective, how conservative or how much you care to invite special assessments into your association, also affects the size of your reserve contributions. So I covered a lot of ground today, but I want to leave you with some additional resources if you want to pursue this a little bit further. If you go to our website, reservestudy.com, you'll find a great ebook on this subject, reserve funding plans, and it's free download, a free open library of written and video resources in our Learning Center. And of course, if you'd like to receive a proposal and get our help calculating your reserve contributions, we'd love to do that. Click that Request a Proposal link. And if you're not getting our regular email newsletters and invitations to webinars such as this one, by all means, sign up for our email list. We're here to help on a monthly basis, so spread the news. We prepare great reserve studies, and we provide great free training designed to improve your future. So at this time, I'll turn the microphone over to Paige, who will coordinate our Q&A time. Paige.